Hello, and welcome to the Race, Wealth, and Health Podcast, a podcast that serves to educate and empower while we explore the intersections of social justice, economic empowerment, and holistic well-being within communities of color. I am your host, Dr. Joycelyn Morris, and I invite you to join me as we dive deep into the crucial topics that shape our lives, challenge the status quo, and strive for a more equitable future for all. So hello, Shannon. It's so great to have you on the podcast today. How are you?
I'm doing really well. How are you, Joycelyn?
I'm good. So I'm so excited to have on the podcast today, Shannon Reinard Demko, who is the founder of Mindful MBA. She's going to chat with us a little bit about mindfulness and how it shows up in general, but specifically in the communities of color. Shannon is also Senior Director of MBA Prep at MLT. And of course, as a result of that, she's my coworker and has become my coworker friend and sounding board. And I like to start with the story of how we met. So we met through work, and I'm sure I probably reached out to you just believing in the need for having support and joining a new organization. And so it just felt natural that we should have a relationship, should understand what we were both doing in our respective programs. Shannon leads MBA Prep, which then leads us to the program that I oversee, MBA Professional Development, and then just have a space as a director to be able to speak about challenges as it relates to that. And so we've become coworker friends. I tell Shannon, she's one of the few people, and it depends on who hears this, that I let follow my personal social media.
I'm honored. It's an honor and a privilege.
That is the level of trust and faith that I have in Shannon. But it's really been great. And I want to say how much I appreciate having you and your calming spirit, which is why I wanted to have you on the podcast. And just having that space as, directors, to women being able to share our experiences. There's not a lot of spaces in organizations for people, especially when you're running a program, but then also a people manager to chat through some of the intricacies that people who are not people managers could never really imagine that you have to deal with, in addition to programmatic things. So I know Shannon, I want to not butcher her very amazing background. So I want you to, tell the listeners a little bit about Mindful MBA.
Sure, yeah. And thank you, Joycelyn, for that lovely introduction. I so appreciate it. I'm grateful for our work relationship and our friendship and for the invitation to be here and participate in this conversation with you today. So yeah, I work at MLT and Senior Director of MBA Prep, and I've been with MLT Management Leadership for Tomorrow for 10 years, which is amazing. I came in as a coach, which is really a big part of who I am and how I approach a lot of my work and different things that I do and a lot of my relationships, just who I am in life. But I came in as a coach after spending 10 years in graduate business admissions. And so I came in through the vein of that expertise and then really was able to step into the powerful work that MLT is doing and advancing racial equity across higher education, across business and, government and civic leadership. So that's been such an incredible experience to have applicable skills to bring into a space like that, like the one we co-inhabit. So also about 10 years ago, I started Mindful MBA, first as a blog to supplement my coaching work. I came from working with MBA applicants and MBA students on the university side and have slowly come to understand how my own personal practice with mindfulness and contemplative thought and things like that could potentially improve some of the challenges that the MBA students I spent all day with and around were encountering, and as well as the applicants that I worked with on behalf of my schools at the time. And really, when I came into coaching applicants through MLT, it was like, okay, I think this can really help. Let me just start writing about this a little bit. I joked that it was minute 59 of my 60-minute coach calls where we'd get through all the GMAT prep and essay writing. And then they'd say, wait a minute, don't you do that calming stuff too? Can we do that? And I'd be like, yeah, let's get calm for 60 seconds. Which, felt a little unresolved. So I just started writing about mindfulness for, I think, common issues that we encounter in lots of spaces, like indecision and feeling stuck creatively, feeling stuck professionally, FOMO, or that sense of like, am I doing the right thing? Everybody else is going in this direction. Should I be going there too? Just like how to navigate those moments. And it evolved over the years to being what it is now, which is a space where I'm able to work with different organizations and really do the work of what Mindful MBA is about, working with organizations and individuals to help infuse their professional lives with the skills and tools that mindfulness offers in a very applicable and accessible way. Right. So sometimes organizations will bring me in to just infuse their health and wellness initiatives at work. And sometimes it's working with individuals on very specific things like getting more comfortable giving presentations. But my goal is always about helping folks understand how much of what mindfulness is about is already within that and just tapping into that so that they can move forward professionally and, of course, personally with more clarity, more purpose, and hopefully a little more calm along the way.
Yes, we all want to be more calm in our day to day lives. But I do want to mention for our listeners that we both work for MLT, so it's Management Leadership for Tomorrow. And as Shannon mentioned, it's an organization geared towards advancing racial equity through educational opportunities, higher educational opportunities as well as employment opportunities. And so I just want to give a little plug there to express what the organization is. We typically work with underrepresented individuals. So usually lower income and or people of color, typically Black, Hispanic, and Native American. And I underline that because it is a very pointed population of individuals that our organization works with. So I'm curious, how did you become passionate about this work? So we talked about how that led you into it, but how did you become passionate about mindfulness and the way that it is important to infuse in both the work that you do programmatically at MLT and also the work that you do outside of
Yeah. So, my own experience with mindfulness, like a lot of things, I'll say it happened by accident, but I'm not really a big believer in accidents. Things make sense in retrospect, but I was a high performing professional with lots of goals and drive and ambition myself as I came out of, grad school and into my career. I think I accidentally went to my first yoga class, but I decided to stick with it. And it was through yoga that I found mindfulness. But I was just going to yoga class after work or on the weekends or whatever. Found mindfulness through those classes and started to realize when I was in a very challenging job at one point that I was by default going into deep breathing and some of the things that I learned in those sessions in challenging moments throughout my workday. And that when I did that, it helped. Lo and behold, like it helped in the moment. And the more I did that and became conscious of how it was helping, the more present and intentional I was able to be in that moment, in how I interacted in that meeting, or how I interacted with that person who was being challenging to me, or how I made that difficult decision when everyone was looking at me being like, what do we do? Because I was in a leadership role at that time as well. And so from there, it came through my own personal experience. I think it's very hard to be as passionate about or to be as authentically committed to something as I am if you're not having your own personal experience with it. And so immediately upon coming into MLT, I realized the usefulness of these tools for the particular space that the fellows that we're working with in MBA prep and also in professional development, the program that you manage for pre-MBAs and MBA students. I did have like an aha moment. If you're interested in the story, I always talk about like the moment the clouds parted and the sun shone through. I was giving a
we
presentation.
love a good Oprah aha moment, so
Yeah, so I had like it happened. Oprah may have orchestrated it. I'm not sure. She wasn't there, but she did lots of things. I was at Stanford University at their business school, their GSB, giving a presentation for MLT to our fellows on getting ready for your admissions interview for business school. And I had coordinated with one of my coworkers and we had our slides and our I do this and you do that. And we were about to go out and start. And I said, I think I want to teach them breath work. And she was like, what? I think I actually said pranayama, which is like a Sanskrit word for a yogi word for just deep breathing. And she was like, I don't know what you're talking about, but please don't change your presentation at the last minute. I was like, give me 90 seconds. I think it would help. And what I was talking about was just using deep breathing while you're in the waiting room waiting to be called back for your interview. You can do this waiting for a job interview, waiting for a doctor's appointment, waiting for a plane that's delayed, right? It's just that the waiting, what do I do rather than stare at my phone, which is what most of us would do? How do I stay present and not zone out, stay ready, stay here, but also deal with the nervousness that I'm feeling that might get in the way of me performing as well as I want to in this interview? And so we gave them all these tips. Here's how you get ready for your interview. And I said, here's another thing you could do, and led them in a 90-second, just let's take some deep breaths exercise. And at that moment, I was like, oh my gosh, this is it. They need this for all of these different moments. These tools that I've been taking for granted help me when I have tough meetings or when I'm super excited and need to rein it in a little bit so I can actually work, right? It's not always about the negative. And so that's when I started really doing the mapping of what would this look like. And that's where Mindful MBA came from. But there literally was that moment of, wait a minute, what am I looking at right now? 350 people doing deep breathing in an interview workshop. This is good. This is useful because, of course, my goal is that maybe they use that for their interviews, but also they use it in other ways. They use it in tough conversations with their partner. They use it in their parenting or their plant parenting or whatever it is, a relationship with their parents, right? That they use it in traffic, that they use it when they're talking to a difficult customer service agent on the phone. It changes the way they interact in the world. And it just happened to also be useful for their interview.
Yes, no, absolutely. I think that is such a great aha moment. I'm sure it must have been quite transformational, like you said, to be on a stage and look out and see 300 plus individuals of color
Yeah.
like doing this exercise.
I do also want to say though, if you wouldn't mind, it took me a while to figure out what Mindful MBA was. So for anyone out there who's like a budding entrepreneur and is like, oh, just waiting for this idea to drop into my head,
Yeah.
full stop, and I'll just, release it out into the world. Like I felt something in that moment. But it took me, several months. I think by the time I was really like LLC'd and trademarked and all that stuff, probably 2 years before Mindful MBA was what you see now. So I just want to say that, like, I did have that moment. I felt that thing. I knew it was a thing, but I didn't get a business delivered to me through the ceiling at Stanford GSD. I'm sure other people have. I think they're known for that, but it didn't happen to me.
No, I appreciate you noting that. That's a really great point to note that while you had the moment of saying this is important, impactful, powerful, it's really good for you to share that, and taking it from that and building it into what it is now and having it come to fruition, it just didn't happen overnight. So I understand, but I do think it's helpful to know that because I think sometimes folks just see things, right? And they assume that there was just an automatic ascension to greatness, if you will. I think there's like a meme or something that circulates ever so often on social when it talks about just different celebrities and people that we have all admired and the age that they were when they really started the career that we know them to be. The two that stand out to me is Oprah Winfrey, like by the time she actually got her own show, how old she was, as well as Samuel L. Jackson when he started acting. I want to say he was in his 40s or something like that. When he got his
Mhm.
first real role. So all to just show and say that it doesn't always just happen immediately, right? It takes time
Right.
and it's okay to take time. That leads me into my next question, which is, what is mindfulness or how is mindfulness actually defined, right? Because there's a lot of chatter around health and wellness and mindfulness, being present. And so I think it's helpful to ground us in a working definition of what mindfulness is.
Sure. Yeah. So mindfulness, as I employ it personally and in Mindful MBA, is a pretty broad term that can apply to a lot of different types of practices. So sometimes people conflate the terms mindfulness and meditation.
Yes.
There are many types of meditation that are technically forms of mindfulness, but there are types of mindfulness that are not meditation.
Yes.
So the definition I use might help a little bit. It comes from a leader in the mindfulness or the secular mindfulness, Western mindfulness space. His name is John Kabat-Zinn, and he's been writing and researching on mindfulness for the better part of the past 50 years. He says that mindfulness is paying attention on purpose to the present moment and non-judgmentally or without judgment, which is interesting. If you break that apart, oftentimes people are like, okay, first of all, mindfulness is meditation. So you might think that, and now we know it isn't. But that means that it's about checking out, floating above. I don't feel the annoyance anymore. I don't feel the suffering. I only feel bliss, nirvana, whatever. And what we're actually talking about is going in, paying attention to the present moment on purpose and non-judgmentally. And what's interesting is when you start doing that, like really down to the granular level, what is actually happening in this moment right now? You start noticing that your thoughts are often in the past or the future or some imaginary state, hypothetical state, but often not actually in the present moment, right? Of what is literally going on right now. We might be having some really elevated stress responses thinking about that interview tomorrow or that meeting we had yesterday or worrying about what's going to happen next week or next year or anything like that. And we're not just here in the moment, sitting in the room responding to what's actually happening here. So we're having stress, a real stress response related to a hypothetical experience or even a past experience. It doesn't exist anymore. And that's detrimental to our physical health, also detrimental to our mental and emotional well-being, because oftentimes we're checked out of the good stuff that's happening right now. You know, a friend may be talking to us and our mind drifts away and we're missing this connection with this friend, or we're missing that we're like walking down the street and there's some cool stuff to look at, birds chirping, whatever. We're missing it because we're somewhere else. So mindfulness can be something that looks like meditation, where you're sitting and you put on your one of your apps that you like for this thing, or you play some music and you sit and just breathe or pay attention. In mindfulness, we always work with a focal point. So mindfulness is not a set of practices that's trying to empty out your mind and get you to zone out. We're trying to get you to notice what you're thinking about, notice what you're feeling in your body, notice what's going on around you. And different practices will attune you to one or more of those things, depending on what you're being guided through. But it's about going inward. What starts to happen when you go in is that you move through the noise and you find that there's some stillness, there's some quiet. There's, you know, you can either go all the way out, go for that nirvana state, whatever that is, or you can go in and find that maybe it's actually there, already in here, if you're willing. But to do that, we got to move through a lot of things. And so part of being a regular practitioner is that consideration of can I really go in and be willing to look at whatever is here right now. And that's a very individual choice and not something a person needs to do alone. There's lots of support out there for working through the stuff that's in here. So I say that as well. But so mindfulness can be about that work, or it can be about like, I'm going to take a few deep breaths because physiologically I know that that stimulates my parasympathetic nervous system. So it takes me out of fight, flight, or freeze, puts me into rest and digest, and helps to shift me out of a stress response. I'm just going to do that. So any practice where you choose to pay attention to something that's happening right here on purpose, and then the tough part, non-judgmentally. So when it becomes challenging, not if, but when you get distracted, because we're not trying to quiet the mind, we're trying to notice where it's going. When you notice that it's left your anchor. So let's say my anchor for my practice is watching my breath or taking deep breaths. And then I start thinking about dinner or something I read online earlier. I notice that I'm thinking about that. And when I notice, I simply choose to come back to the breath. Okay, I'm watching the breath again. Oh, I got distracted. Let me choose to come back. What is amazing is the noticing is the practice. So the practice is not about like batting 1,000 and never getting distracted. It's about noticing as often as possible and choosing to come back, because that is when you are in charge of where your attention goes. That's the practice.
I was actually going to say, when you mentioned that it's not about quieting the mind, it's about noticing where it goes. Would you say, because I guess when I think about meditation, again, I don't have a lot of the, like, I just know what I know in terms of general, like, I always think that the goal is to try to quiet the mind, is it not? And so, like, is that even just part of the difference between meditation and mindfulness?
Yeah, and different types of meditation. So there are types of meditation where the goal is to empty the mind, to silence the mind, to be thinking of nothing. And that's just simply not the specific goal of mindfulness. Those might be great practices. I mean, I encourage everyone who's interested in this work to explore different options. And whenever I lead a mindfulness session, if it's like intro to mindfulness for a group, I'm going to talk about a bunch of different practices. And I'm even going to sample a few different practices, because if I do one thing and you're like, that didn't work for me, I want you to know there are other options. you don't have to just do it that way. You can do some other things too. We can do visualization. We can work with breath. We can just work with body awareness. We can work with awareness of the distractions around us. If you're practicing in a very noisy place, I get asked a lot. Like, I live in New York City. There's sirens, there's car horns, there's people yelling, there's animals, whatever. Like, tune into that. That is here right now. And if emotion or thought or reaction arises as a result of hearing all of that, notice that. See what that's about, right? We get curious and we start exploring what's in here instead of just taking for granted that we can always just react and respond, and we go on autopilot, but we're not paying attention to where our attention goes, right? We just move about the world and snap back at people and honk the horn and get distracted and fall into judgment about how can anybody practice mindfulness in this city? It's so loud. I'll never be able to do it here. And then that's the story, instead of like, oh, this is interesting. This is what's here right now.
Yep.
Let me explore that. Let me just sit with that a little bit. And eventually you might find a little bit more quiet. You might find a little more stillness, or you might not. But really what you're cultivating is the ability to notice what's going on with you and to see it from the position of, in mindfulness, we often talk about the thinking mind and the observing mind. And the observer notices the thoughts, the emotions, the physical experiences, that the experience of Joycelyn, the experience of Shannon, instead of just shifting into like, well, every time, my brother calls, we end up in a fight and that's just how it goes.
Right.
Well, what if you sat in that conversation a little bit differently? It doesn't make whatever your brother does right, but it does make your experience different in interacting with him.
Right.
Right.
No,
And that can be the beginning of change for both of you.
yes,
Mhm.
absolutely. And along those lines too, I'd love to hear from you about how you feel like race shows up in your work, working specifically with the population MLT and or even population that you work with outside of MLT. Yeah, is there any common threads or things that you find in working with people of color, as it relates to mindfulness and how you've helped them to use that in in their leadership or in their desire for employment and whatever goal oriented things that they make.
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I mean, it's one of the great honors and privileges literally of my life that I get to be in the space that I'm in every day in such it feels really special that I'm able to do this work with populations of color specifically, especially being a white woman myself, and to be granted the trust and the opportunity to do this as a coach and as a mindfulness instructor. And I think, as mindfulness practitioners, like I said, we're going inward and we're going to find what's there. And each of us has a different inner landscape. I think if we're somehow able to pull it all out and put it on the table, we'd see that we have a lot more in common in there than we do not, just as humans. So the majority of the individuals I'm working with MLT are living in the United States. Many of them were born in the United States. This is a primarily domestic population. Even if they're born outside of the United States, they're now living in the United States.
Right.
And that's a very specific experience right now to be a person of color living in the United States. It always has been,
And that's what I was gonna say.
always,
Always.
always has been. So right now it's at the forefront of the societal conversation, I'll say in quotes, that we're having. And so we're able to start pulling it out and looking at it. And I am really honored to be able to be a part of that work and encouraging the people that we work with in MLT to turn inward. I have done a lot of training myself in being a trauma informed instructor. I've done training with the National Institutes for Cognitive Behavioral Medicine on working specifically with individuals of color in doing mindfulness based work, so that there are no, I won't say no because there can never be none, but there are as few as possible assumptions that I'm making about what is okay and what is to be expected in doing inner work. And it equips me to offer spaciousness and reminders that whatever arises in your journey inward is yours to look at or not look at,
Yeah.
right? But that there's so much strength in the willingness to go inward like that. But it has supported me in being more intentional about the variety of cultures that exist, even within the three populations we specifically work with in MLT, multitude of cultures, multitude of religious and spiritual backgrounds, multitude of expectations and assumptions about doing this work and the permissibility of it, for example. And one of the things that's most important to me in Mindful MBA is that folks understand that in many cases, we're just breathing. We're just taking some deep breaths and everybody's doing it already. You don't have to believe anything in particular. You don't need to have a certain background, but it has made me so much more intentional about saying that. The last time I gave a presentation for MLT, I said, one of the things that I often do through Mindful MBA are practices that look a lot like meditation, but I know that there's quite a few different folks in the room from different backgrounds today. And some of you may not want to do that or may not even feel like you're allowed to do that. So we're not going to do that today. We're just going to breathe. And I had folks come up to me afterwards and like, thank you for doing that. That allowed me to participate. That made me feel comfortable participating in the 5-minute breathing exercise that we did.
Yeah.
I've also become very attuned to the presence of trauma in the body. I'm also a yoga teacher here in Atlanta where I live, and I spend time working with people's bodies all the time and guiding them and interacting with their bodies. And I'm a trauma survivor myself. And so I understand that there's a great book out there called The Body Keeps the Score related to trauma work. And all of us, all humans are holding trauma in their bodies somewhere.
Yeah.
People of color in the United States are holding trauma that is accrued on a daily basis through their own personal experience of moving through the world with non-white skin, right? That is really what it is about. The average daily activities. It's, death by 1,000 paper cuts, as the saying goes. Oh, this just happened. Oh, this person looked at me this way. This coworker said this to me over and over and over again. And we have the stats to show that people of color tend to have higher reported rates of mental health challenges, and often will connect that to their experience of living as people of color in the United States. And I'm guessing that this exists in other Western countries as well. We know that the trauma continues to accrue. So there's a big trauma that any of us can experience, a loss, an injury, anything that you aren't expecting that the body has to absorb, literally like a hit, right? That the body has to absorb. And then there's the little traumas that some of us experience more than others, depending on our circumstances. And then there's the trauma we inherit.
Yeah.
The trauma that's passed to us through the people who raised us, the communities that we're a part of, that we come to understand that it's actually handed to us. This is the legacy. This is what you move forward with. And there's interesting scientific evidence of epigenetic trauma that is held in the body by a person that is then passed to their child as part of their DNA. And we see this happening generation over generation. And put all of those things together, you've got some bodies holding some stuff, right? Especially in communities of color. And I'm always conscious of that when I'm leading even a 5-minute breathing exercise, that we all need to tend to ourselves as we come into these practices. They're an act of self-care, right? And self-care isn't always bubble baths and things like that. Sometimes self-care is, going to the dentist or reading a challenging article, but these are powerful acts that can sometimes be really challenging. And so we have to remember that it is our right always to stop, to say, I'm not going any further. And also to acknowledge when there are days when paying attention to the body doesn't feel good.
Right.
And so I'm very mindful, quote unquote, when I'm teaching, that not to only offer cues that guide a person into the awareness of their body, not to consistently require people to be present in their body. The body is here right now. Paying attention to it will connect you to the present moment, but that's not always the right decision for someone who's holding a tremendous amount of trauma in the body. It can be a beautiful journey to move towards that with the right support. and coming into loving relationship with your physical self. But the extent to which an individual person is going to want to walk into and through that journey is entirely up to them.
Right.
It's not up to me. I learned as a coach and as a yoga instructor that there's a big difference between gently working with someone as they open up and pushing someone until they break open. Those are two different things, because the gentle opening is self-guided, self-directed, and eventually creates love, acceptance, contentment. The pushing and the breaking creates shame. And then we're left with something else to deal with. And that too is repairable. It's just not ideal. And so remembering that mindfulness is self-guided, self-directed, there is support. There are people like me who can guide you through mindfulness practice. There's apps. There's also a world of mental health professionals and some really incredible resources for communities of color. Specifically, we have an MLT alum who's founded Therify, which is a wonderful resource for finding mental health practitioners of color. And there's others out there as well, finding spaces where you can feel supported in gently doing the excavation work of figuring out what's going on in me, so that I don't just keep passing things on to the people who come after me.
Well, that's all we have for this week's episode. Want to learn helpful tips for practicing mindfulness? Don't forget to join us next week to continue the conversation. Enjoyed the show? Be sure to like and rate the podcast. You can find the Race, Wealth, and Health podcast on multiple platforms, including Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Be sure to subscribe and turn on your notifications so you never miss an episode. I also want to hear from you, so don't forget to connect with me on social media. You can follow the podcast on Instagram and Facebook at Race, Wealth, Health. By joining the online community, you'll stay updated on the latest episodes, behind the scenes insights, and engaging discussions. Share your thoughts, comments, and questions there. I appreciate your support in sharing the podcast with your friends, family, and colleagues who may also find value in these conversations. Thank you again for joining me on this journey. Until next time, take care, stay informed, and keep up the good fight for equality.